today we will discuss a topic that is useful for higher education for NET paper 1 as well as for UPSC mains GS. So the topic is Education 2030. Now Education 2030 is a agenda which has been propounded under the Sustainable Millennium Development Goals, the Sustainable Development Goals, and this is the fourth Sustainable Development Goal that is focusing on education. Now in this lecture we would talk about the focus that is shifted from education to all to education by the year 2030, that is 2030, and we will discuss the special focus on India. Now to start with, let's talk about something about Sustainable Development Goals. So Sustainable Development Goals are those which deal with transformation of the world. Now there are 17 goals that are being propounded in all, which target around 169 areas, of which the fourth goal is focusing purely on education. Now sustainable development, the term itself talks about using the present day resources in such a manner that they are there for the future generations to use, or the future generations can use them over the time. So we must use the resources in such a manner that they are used for today as well as for future. Now these goals target for the next 15 years, the next coming 15 years, with a major principle of 5P. Now these are the 5 P's that are discussed under the Sustainable Development Goal, that is people, planet, prosperity, peace and partnership. So all these Sustainable Development Goals revolve around these 5 P's, that is the people, planet, prosperity, peace and partnership. Now under the Incheon Declaration, education was discussed. The Incheon Declaration was adopted in May 2015 at the World Education Forum, and it talked about a single agenda that deals with education. There were 4 basic ideas that were included under the Incheon Declaration. The first was gender equality, so providing equal opportunity for education for both a male and a female child. Then inclusive and equitable education. Inclusive and equitable education not only at an elementary level, it talks about at primary, secondary, tertiary, technical and vocational levels. Then you have the quality of education that should be brought up, and finally a lifelong learning opportunity should be provided, which would include the ideas of adult education as well. So higher education, lifelong learning opportunity should be provided. So this was the basic idea based on which the education goals for 2030 were declared. Now the basic principle that focused the Incheon Declaration was that education should be considered as a fundamental human right, and it should be an enabling right which should enable people to get literate and get educated. It is meant for public good, and if there is gender equality, then the education for all would grow in a much better fashion. So this was the major principle that was involved under the Education 2030. However, there were some strategic approaches that were used. Now these were an effort to provide effective and inclusive education. First of all, improve the education policies, provide equitable and quality education as we discussed, focus on financing the education, and evaluating, monitoring and following up the targets that are set up and whether they are achieved or not. So these are the basic ideas or basic approaches that were covered under the Sustainable Development Goal 4 that was focusing on education. Now the basic provision is to provide 12 years of free public funded, that is it should be funded by government, and education at all levels, of which 9 years should be compulsory. Now this is a slight modification from the existing scenario that occurs, where we talk about free and compulsory education from 6 to 14 years. Now this has been changed to providing 12 years of free public funded education system, of which 9 years are compulsory, which lead to relevant learning outcomes and should be ensured for all without any discrimination of gender, race, religion, caste or creed. Now next is, if we focus it specifically on India, we will see there are developments that have taken place and future developments that are assumed under this policy. Now if we start from 1990s post liberalization, we see that district primary education program was launched in 93-94. Then you had the Sarv Shiksha Abhiyan that focused on universalizing the primary education in 2000. Then came the Right to Education Act in 2009 that talked about free and compulsory education from the age group of 6 to 14 years that we were talking about. So these were the policies and the reforms that took place in India for school education till now, and now comes the education in 2030, the goals of which are propounded, which mainly talks about equitable distribution. Now if we talk about till 2000, we can say there were nearly 59 million children who were enrolled in primary education. There were around 65 million students which were enrolled in secondary education, and out of which you need to improve those by 2013 and further by 2030. The idea was that laid forward was that by 2013 there were around 23% of the primary schools and around 61% of the secondary schools had facilities of computer. And by 2030, the goal is to provide all schools with all schools should be technologically driven or should be well versed with computers and computer labs. So that's a kind of structural change that has been coming around, not only in the primary education but also at a secondary education and at a higher level university education. So if we look around at the school scenario of India, we can see in 1990 the enrollment of school student was only 15 crores, which increased to 25 crores in 2010, and the expenditure that the government was incurring in 1990 was 0.12 lakh crores, which increased to 1.86 crore. That is a significant amount of government funds went into as an expenditure for school education. If we talk about the dropouts in school education, those are very high for India. So the gross enrollment ratio was merely 56% in case of India, in contrast to USA where it is 93%. If we talk about enrollments in private primary schools, it is merely 1% in Japan. That means 99% of the students in Japan avail government schools or go for education in government schools. However, this proportion in India is significantly higher at 32% in contrast to 9% in the United States. So there has been a high amount of enrollment in private primary education, and this is what it is projected for 2030. The number of schools which are at present at 16 lakhs would be consolidated to 11 lakhs. That is, the schools which are having a population of less than 300 students would be merged under a common platform. So what would happen is merger of schools would take place. However, the number of students is ought to increase. So the number of teachers should increase from 90 lakhs to 110 lakhs. The pupil teacher ratio would remain more or less the same, that is 27. With every 27 students there should be one teacher. The school going population would increase by around 1 crore. The enrollment ratio would increase by around 5 crores. The enrollment in private schools is ought to increase significantly from 37% of the total enrollment to 67% of the total enrollment. That means most of the schools in future would be towards private sector. So the government would have a lesser burden to maintain the school. However, government would bring in restrictions for the private school, and by the RTI Act under section 12(1)(c), it is mandatory that 25% of the seats are reserved for marginalized communities, and of which government would provide the subsidy for the education in those schools. So that is a scenario that is projected for 2030 for schools. Now what are the key level changes for school education? The first would be the school rating would be linked to student outcome. So if the student outcome is good, the school ratings would be done. Similar to what has been done for the university level, you had the NEC committee. Similar proposals are there now for the schools, that schools should have a rating scale. And finally, you have the pre-primary schools should cover up to 4 years of child. The reforms for teacher eligibility should be more strengthened, should be bettered off, and there are stronger recruitment norms that should be laid off. Again, there should be a career progression scheme that should be done for the teachers to maintain higher quality of teachers and education in the school. That would be again linked to the school performance and the students' performance in the school. And the section 12(1)(c) that of the RTE that we already talked about talks about 25% of the seats should be reserved for the marginalized communities, and this cost would be reimbursed by the government. The next is the National Repository for Open Education Resources talks about providing open resources for education for both private and public schools. Then you have the Digital Open Education Resource which gives incentives to private sectors to release content under open source or open licensing. There should be networking of teachers. So, teachers of one school should be connected to teachers of other schools, and that would enhance a peer learning among teachers. And then there should be a massive online open program, the MOOCs, that would provide online education or online curriculum by the faculty to institutes and teachers to maintain the quality of education in the respective areas. Now, under the Millennium Development Goal in 2006 and 7, there was a Millennium Project that was conducted that talked about education and learning outcomes. This education and learning outcomes was a project that was started in 2006-7. This was dealing with the real Delphi technique that was used for this project. Now, real Delphi technique is a technique that talks about efficient method to collect expert opinions in the respective fields. This technique was devised by Ted Gordon, and this was applied by Rand Corporation. Now, this technique laid down 19 possibilities for education sector, and those were, some of these we can mention as genetically increased intelligence, portable artificial intelligence devices, the chemistry of brain enhancements, concept of e-teaching, artificial microbe enhancing intelligence, and so on and so forth. So, all these 19 parameters were dealt with, and based on these you had expert opinions by the means of real Delphi technique that was used to analyze those, and then there were learning outcomes that were determined, and those again focused on inclusive education and those which we have discussed previously. Now, finally you have the education scenario at a university level. At the university level, there is a 3-tier system that is proposed. This 3-tier system talks about first elite research institutes or research universities. The second is specialized research, specialized universities, I could say, which deal in their own areas. And finally, you have the medium and the high ranking colleges. That means the concept of average or below average colleges would be totally abolished, and only colleges that would exist would be medium or high ranking colleges by 2030. There would be expansion of a differentiated university system which would include these 3 categories. Then there would be idea of learner centered education program. There would be more focus on using technology for the purpose of education, and again there are reforms proposed in the sector of governance for education. It is assumed that by 2030, 1 out of every 4 graduate would stand from India. India is going to produce around 140 million people who would be in the age group of who would be kind of college going population, and as a result they would have more technological resources, and the quality should be focused at higher education. So, the main agenda for Education 2030 is to shift the focus from providing just the basic education at the elementary level to providing quality education not only at the school levels but across the learning opportunities that you provide. So, it is at the school level as well as at the college level. So with this we covered the idea of education 2030, the Sustainable Millennium Development Goal 4. We will be discussing more topics related to the NET paper 1 as well as UPSC GS in the further sessions. You can subscribe to our classes for more updates. Have a good day ahead.